As a kid, I was raised in a small fishing community on the eastern side of Canada, surrounded by the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Boreal Forest. The entirety of land was close to 4,000 foot square, with an even smaller number of residents sprawled out over Main Street. The main road rings straight through our little town, and the farming houses spread widely between areas of trees, that which were changed into domestic residential homes when agriculture stopped being profitable. In total, our community is surrounded by a vast expanse of ocean and a seemingly endless barrage of trees that was spread over 55% of Canada's entire country. Sandy was a Shetland sheepdog. Whether more fit to herding and tracking sheep over grassy plains rather than deers and rabbits through a dense forest, it didn't stop me from taking him on every excursion I possibly could. Sandy had been by his side for enough hunting trips that he'd grown accustomed to waking up just before the breaking daylight, and on a few occasions helped me track down small game like squirrels and rabbits through considerably large areas of forest. Sandy wasn't my property, and wasn't treated like he belonged to me. Sandy was a member of the family, my best companion, and my truest friend. I think fondly back on those times. He'd sit in front seat of my truck without being told, ready to go for a walk in whatever part of the forest I took him to. I can honestly say that there will never be a dog that will fill the same void Sandy left in my life. I find that dog lovers can relate to that sentiment more than others. It was the 30th of October, the first day of deer hunting season. I've been talking with my family about taking Sandy, my hunting gear, and some essentials to one of the cabins my grandfather owned in his heyday, off an unmarked road a few hundred miles into the wilderness for a few days. This was met with a lot of protesting, but nothing could stop me from getting in some time with looking for wild game in the area that wasn't already picked clean by illegal hunters earlier that month. Everything was packed in an old blue Ford, Sandy included. A few hours of driving later, we had set up camp in my grandfather's old secluded cabin. Here's where things got fucked up. Sandy, I'm so sorry. I spent most of my time being in the wilderness, where there was only a handful of times that things had gotten weird for me. But usually everything can be explained with a scientific reason. That's why I brushed off Sandy's weirdness on the first few nights, chalking up to a nervous dog capable of hearing far-off noises of various coyotes, wolves, bears, and moose. This was untouched territory, of course. There had been plenty of time for wildlife to set up camp here, too. The first night was fairly normal. I had set up Sandy's bed in the corner of the living room, next to the TV. That looked more like it came out of the early 90s. I figured I'd give Sandy the option to have somewhere to lie down for a while, despite the fact that he slept curled up with me 9 times out of 10, close to 10 at night. Sandy looked straight at the wooden door and whined. I figured he needed to piss, and I opened the door and let him out, not worried about having my best friend stray too far from me. Instead, he just sat inside the door looking out at the forest edge beyond the path. I too stood and looked out for a few minutes before deciding. He just heard some errant creatures close to the cabin. The rest of the night was fairly normal, and Sandy slept fine with me. The second night, I chucked the weirdness up to Sandy's stress. Early that day, we had been walking a few miles through the woods beyond the house, and I thought we heard the sound of twigs cracking under something heavy. I hope it wasn't a moose, because my shotgun wouldn't have stood a chance. Something changed in Sandy that I didn't pay close attention to at the time. He hunched himself on his hind legs, his front pressed close to the ground, his mouth pulled over his teeth, and growled towards nothingness. I figured we could try again hunting later, if whatever it was had left, and should he be feeling up to it. But once we were inside, he didn't want to move. Even when I tried to get him to go outside to do his business, he just sat at the door and cried, wailing at me to let me know he didn't want to go out there. I didn't pressure him. If he pissed on the floor, so be it. Sandy never acted up before. I could excuse an incident or two. If he didn't want to go out there, must have been a bear, I thought, before locking the door and calling it a night. The third night is where things went to hell, and I don't fully understand what happened. Sandy didn't eat all day. I meant to shoot a rabbit early in the morning when Sandy decided he didn't want to come out any longer than he had to and retired inside for the day. I cooked it up, threw a little gravy on it, and gave it to my dog. I didn't do this all the time, but I figured now was a special occasion. Maybe a treat would put him in a better mood for another walk the next day. Sandy didn't touch it, didn't so much as sniff at it. Instead, he just sat by my couch and watched the doorway intently. I tucked him under one of my arms, and he laid his head on my lap. Eyes locked on the door. Close to 3 hours of watching it, grainy VHS tapes on an outdated television set, Sandy started crying, hugging himself close to my body. This is where my judgment took me down the wrong path, for the first of many times. It must sound silly, being my dog's protector rather than my dog being mine. But this was my family. I figured there was something out there that was scaring Sandy so bad that it was my job to do something about it. I loaded my gun and opened the door, stood in the doorway and waited. I must have waited at least a half hour, staring into nothing. There was barely any sound, save for the faint buzzing of insects and rustling leaves in the cold autumn wind. Mooses aren't elegant creatures, and if it was a moose, I would have heard it coming. Around the 40-minute mark, Sandy took off like a shot into the darkness of the tree beyond the path, barking wildly. I started to get worried, despite my knowledge that my dog isn't entirely helpless in the wilderness. There's still bigger animals that would have liked to take a chunk out of him if there wasn't a lot of food for the winter. I heard Sandy's bark fade away in the distance, and then stop altogether. I waited hours standing in the doorway with my shotgun cocked and ready to put down whatever it was waiting in the woods. I waited hours for Sandy to come back to the house. I waited until the sun cracked through the trees, and then waited until that night, sitting on my porch step, fending off sleep deprivation to see my dog back. Sandy did come back, but not for another 3 days. Fog rolled in at that point. It was getting darker. The night pinged the sky in a navy blue. Trekking over the last few days proved futile, and I started to get worried that I'd need to leave to find more provisions to last me the next few nights. I couldn't leave Sandy up there, lost in the woods, cold, and probably hungry. The thought that he might be waiting out there for me to find him and bring him back home was distressing enough. I was packing a bag that hung on the coat rack next to the door with what I needed for the next day's trip. I figured tomorrow would be the last day before I have to go into town and see if my father would help me find Sandy. He was a retired, graying man, but I was sure if I brought up Sandy's name, he'd be more than willing to help me search for him. Thankfully, Sandy came back before I'd even finished my train of thought. I saw him from the window on the path that leads down the main road. a few dozen feet from the house. Normally I'd hear him scamper to the doorway and pop the door a few times, eager to come in, but this was different. I could see the reflection of his eyes, his green pearls in the murky fog that had swamped the house. And for a moment, I thought it might have been an animal, but the outline of his body, the thick wisp of low-lying clouds were unmistakable. Still, despite myself, I hesitated. There was something different about his body language. I stared out the window for a few moments before reason overcame my gut instinct. Sandy could be hurt, I thought. Or worse. I flung the doorway open, but he didn't come right away. Instead, he stood there, watching me intently, and he didn't even move when I whistled to him. "Here, Sandy!" I coaxed him to the house. "Here, boy!" The way he moved was different. It was though his hips had been dislocated. The ankle of his paws changed direction with every step, as though he'd forgotten how to walk properly. His head bowed low to the ground, his teeth weren't bared. He didn't seem aggressive. The only thing I could describe him as he gave me a look was sheepish, like he'd gotten into something like he wasn't supposed to, and I yelled at him for it. I thought he might have hurt himself hopping onto an elevated step if he had dislocated his hips. But he did just fine. His back half swung a little, oddly enough, and his paws almost folded underneath himself. But he didn't go sprawling. He sat on the step and didn't take his look off of me. It wasn't until I moved from the doorway completely and opened the door wide and waiting for him to walk in that he actually moved. Straight to his bed. He didn't stop at my hand and sniff at me. He didn't wait for pets or to jump up on me like he used to. It was straight to his bed, where he sat and watched me for quite some time afterwards. I returned to the movie at hand. I called him a few times, but he didn't respond. His ears didn't so much as raise to the sound of my voice, or a pat of my hand on the worn-out couch beside me. I had missed my buddy, but I wasn't about to move him physically towards me. There was something about him that said I shouldn't have let him in. I chalked it up to silliness, and a few hours later, I went to bed. The more I think about it, I don't recall him blinking once. He sat there like a statue, and when I turned off the light, I could still see the reflection of his jade-green eyes following me as I went to my room and shut the door. I could have swore I heard him walk in the night. The sound of his nails click against the wood floor, coming up to the door to my room. But they were slow and deliberate. They weren't like the quickness of the Sandy realizing I had gone to bed and coming to curl up. I heard the noise stop outside my bedroom, but I didn't hear his whine. I thought nothing of it and fell into a deep sleep. When I woke in the morning, I figured it must have been a dream. Sandy was still standing there, upright, in the position I left him when I went to bed. It was as though he didn't even move a muscle the entire night. And when I said good morning, he didn't so much as wag his tail. He did follow me into the kitchen, but he paused at the doorway when I put the bowl on the floor and filled it up with supermarket dog food. Once again, his back half weirdly moved as he slowly made his way towards me. There was a nagging feeling that something was off-putting by the way he looked that day. It was like he had gotten longer overnight. Sandy hunched down again, like when he was walking to the door the night before. He hadn't come into the kitchen. I figured he must have been hungry being out in the wild for so long. He eyed me, like he was waiting for me to come a little closer, rather than touch his food. It goes without saying, but after a few moments of the staring contest between me and the unblinking dog, I called out the foolishness and called his name loudly. Not even a flinch. I didn't want to move any closer to my dog to leave the kitchen door, But this is my Sandy. Most damage he's ever done was eat flies. Sure enough, as I passed him, he turned, his body swayed unnaturally. But he didn't move towards me. When I left that day, I couldn't find anything. No deer tracks in the mud that were made a few days prior, and one of the cold that was actually made by trails in the woods. I couldn't hear any bugs or birds, or even howls of the nearby coyote. The only sounds miles away from my campsite were my own breathing, the sound of crunching leaves under my feet. When the sun started to set, I started to make my way back. But I should have just packed my shit and left. Just beyond a cluster of trees, with the house just visible beyond the rise, I figured out the reason why the animals abandoned this place. Generally, when there are mass animal deaths, that usually means there's something wrong with the area of slaughter, and wildlife is usually smart enough to get the hell out of Dodge. Even cats are bred instinctively not to drink from foul water that's close to where their food is. Because if you saw an animal close to a stream, you'd figure that the stream was tainted and have to find another water source. Hundreds of squirrels were disemboweled and strewn across the grass in an almost perfect circle. Most of them were skinned alive. But when I turned to heave up all the contents in my stomach, there were a few of them that were inside out. I couldn't help but vomit repeatedly as I tried my best to walk around the tiny circle of organs and mashed up bodies, not just over the sight, but because the smell was ungodly. I don't know how long they've been there, but if I had stumbled across it sooner, I would have left with Sandy in tow immediately after. Gradually, the body stopped and delved off of a random dead squirrel here and there. The biggest thing I managed to find, was just a few feet off the ungodly feeding ground, was a deer. It looked as though something had decided to skin it from height to neck and drape some of the skin over a branch, like someone was tanning the hide. I don't know how long it had been there. It smelled like it had been dead for quite some time. Despite the fact there wasn't a single fly, the head had been cut off clean, just above the shoulders, and when I realized the organs had been removed, I moved from a walking pace in the forest to a jog. Thankfully, the cabin wasn't too far off. I heaved one final time, wiped my hand on the back of my sleeve, and looked up to the house to see Sandy watching me from the window. I tried to reason with myself and tell myself Sandy's odd behavior could have been trauma. It was stupid to think of it now, but at the time, it was the only reasonable explanation I could keep myself from going insane. The elongating body could have just been loneliness getting to me. Sandy had realized something was up with this place. The second I noticed, I should have taken this warning and headed back off to town. Once the door was shut behind me, I started packing the food and essentials back into boxes, moving quickly to try and get my things into the truck before night came. It might be dangerous to try and maneuver my way through the trails at night, as the hills off of Kelly Mountain were steep, and in the pitch blackness, my only companion being my headlights, it would have been easy to slide off into a ravine and never be heard from again. I didn't want to stay one more night, but I had no choice. I had to get back to the house just moments before the sun receded into the horizon. We were bathed in a navy blue sky once again. I didn't pay attention to Sandy. He just sat in his bed and watched me pack. I figured no harm, no foul. I'll throw his stuff in the back of the truck in the morning. We get back in town before the next day. Glancing back at him for a moment, it was just a passing thought, but he looked longer today. And when I went to bed, I had a hard time getting to sleep for the next few hours. It must have been close to 4 or 5 in the morning when I heard it. The low sound of whistling, the same whistle I used to call my dog. I broke out into a cold sweat when I realized that whoever slaughtered the squirrels hung the skin up, left what he didn't need. He could have well broken into my house. The door to my room didn't make a sound as I opened it up slowly, thankfully. I waited for a moment, listening for someone to call my dog for a few seconds before I dared poke my head out. from the door frame to get a good look at whoever it was that hurt my Sandy. The outside door was open. All I saw was a hat-black Sandy, too long and lanky, almost coiled around the back of the door. His front half was outside, whatever it had been impersonating my dog. It was whistling slowly, calling for Sandy. When I could have sworn that it hunched down on the ground again, it said,
Sandy.
in the most ungodly voice I've ever fucking heard. I closed the door just as softly as I opened it. I don't know how long I waited, my back pressed up against the door. I knew. I left my gun in the bag on the coat rack. I know I didn't sleep. I waited until I saw the sun break over the horizon, and I waited some more, until it must have been midday when I finally got the balls to open up the door again, made a break for the truck. I wouldn't die in this place. Sandy was gone. The door was open. His food was untouched. The fridge was open, and all the meat was gone. I didn't bother packing his stuff. I just threw my bag over my shoulder and made my way to the floor as fast as I could. And I turned on the ignition. I couldn't describe the feeling that overcame me as I realized I'd have to leave Sandy in this place. The thought he could be dead was never a thought in my mind. I don't think I could cope with the knowledge that whatever I allowed in my house, whatever disemboweled those animals, could have done the same with him. I made my way down the winding paths, the roads, as fast as I possibly could without veering off the cliff. I felt like I was turning in circles down this labyrinth that'd take me back to the house. But when I reached pavement on the stretch of road back to town, I felt relief wash over me, thinking I was safe. Just as I was pulling onto the cement, I felt something hard hit the back windshield, sending broken glass into the passenger seat. I only got a glimpse of a deer's decapitated head catching on one of the unbroken glass and tumbling into the back seat. I cried for most of the way home, hands clenching the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles were white. I wish I could leave this off on a positive note. I wish I could tell you I found Sandy at home, waiting for me. I wish I could tell you this was the end of it. A traumatizing experience in the woods that I'll get over in time. Last night, I found it hard to sleep. I kept replaying the entirety of the trip in Kelly's Mountains in my head. I figured I wouldn't be sleeping for a while, and laid there, listening to the wind through my open window. I could have sworn I heard the whistle I used to call my dog, coming from the forest's edge. If you go on trips with your dog, I advise you don't let them out of your sight for too long. What comes back might not be your dog.